Family Resource Center on Disabilities is the Region 1 Parent Training and Information Center of Illinois. You can reach us at 312-939-3513. Email us at info@frcd.org or visit our website at www.frcd.org. We encourage you to follow us on Twitter at FRCDPTI and subscribe to our YouTube page at FRCD1231. We also encourage you to like us on Facebook. Family Resource Center on Disabilities is not a law firm or legal service agency. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn webinar entitled Dissecting the IEP Part 3, Placement and Least Restrictive Environment. This presentation will be presented by parent trainer Lynn Betts. If at any point you have questions, please type those into the question panel on the right-hand side, and we will answer those. Or you could also raise your hand. The PowerPoint presentation will be provided following this webinar. Thank you. And also, this webinar is being recorded. Okay, Lynn, you may begin.
Hi, and welcome to the webinar. Today's webinar would be the least restricted environment, which we know as LRE. But first, I'd like to take a moment out to introduce who we are, who FRCD is, which is Family Resource Center on Disability. We are a Parent Training Information Center, and we are here to help those learn about their rights and responsibility under the Individual with Disability Education Act. When families or parents or professionals come and learn more about what the rights are, or understand IDEA, they are able to make a more informed decision about their child or about the person that they're serving IEP program. We also help parents and professionals learn how to communicate more or better with the school or understand the language that is written in their IEP. Okay, so starting with the least restricted environment, which we know is LRE. When we have an IEP, you hear a lot of times they're talking about LRE, which is really means the placement. The least restricted environment is where the child would get where would the child get the services. And I want to start with this, give you a little highlight of this federal court of Overty versus the Board of Education. And I like the expression that was used by saying inclusion is a right, not a special privilege for a selected few. Because a student or a child have a disability, this doesn't mean that the child would be excluded or should be excluded because based on his disability. This court case centered around a child with Down syndrome. And the family, the parents wanted their child with Down, this student, to be included in the general education classroom with his non-disabled peer, with the support, accommodation, supplementary aid, and services within the general education classroom. One of the highlights of this court case was that even if the student disability have an adverse effect on their learning, and they may need, because based on their need, they may need to be placed in a more restricted environment, this doesn't exclude the student from participating with their non-disabled peers. So this brought in the highlights of even if the child have to be placed with the explanation in a more restricted environment, this student can also participate with his non-disabled peer in the extracurricular programs, after school program. They can participate in gym. They can also participate in prep class, such as like a technology class, music, and any other event that the school may offer, what they would offer to non-disabled peers. There is no prerequisites for a student to be placed in the general education classroom. So when you have a student or a family bring their student who have a disability into the general, to the public school, the first thing they should be looked at upon as as a student without a disability, as a general education student. The administration should not readily make a assumption that this child needs to be placed in a more restricted environment because they have noticed or they have been noted that the child or the student have a disability. So every student, when they first start off, are considered general education students. Again, as we talked about, in the least restricted environment, our students with disability have a right to participate in extracurricular, non-academic services and activities. Now, I know there has been some cases where a student may have some medical issues such as seizures, disorder, and through their IEP, there might, in that plan, that it might warrant a nurse services or maybe a paraprofessional services. Now, that's not to say that because these students will participate in the extracurricular, maybe an after-school program, that paraprofessional would be there or that nurse would be there. The family would be noted that that student would not have that the nursing services there or the paraprofessional, but that student can participate in those activities. If it's during the school timing, maybe some schools start at 7:45 to 3, 9 to 2, or whatever time the school setting is happening for all students, then that students, with the support of the nurse, with the support of the aide or any other supplementary aid and services that student have in his or her IEP, they can participate in those extracurriculars, regardless of what the IEP is stating about the student. The student have a right to non-academic services and activities. Now, when we talk about the least restricted environment, there's a continuum where the child would be placed, either in a general education classroom with support, or no, first of all, with no support. That's general education classroom. Then the next continuum is a general education with support. Then we talk about a resource placement. We're going to get into all of this as we get further into the webinar. But just keep in mind, we have to look at whatever the placement is, what is the potential harmful effect on the child or on the quality of service that he or she may need. Some of the harmful effects may be physical, but we have to figure out how can a child be harmed physical in whatever placement setting that is warranted for the child. Other harmful effects that must be listed is social and emotional. Sometimes when the child is in more of a restricted environment, such as a self-contained classroom, or maybe they're getting a pull-out, the student may feel embarrassed. That's a harmful effect on the child. The student may feel that that other children will make fun of them, or maybe they become bullied because they're being pulled out. So those are some of the things when we say harmful effect that can affect the child based on the placement. Again, another thing that we have to consider is that a child with a disability, if they are in an age-appropriate regular classroom, they cannot, it should just be put in, they cannot be just put into a most restricted environment because they need a modification or they need some form of accommodation in the general education classroom or to access the general education classroom. So because a student may be having some learning deficit in reading, that solely cannot say this is the reason why he or she needs to be placed in a more restricted environment. There have to be other factors. Okay, now when we talk about special classes, that's other than a general education classroom with supplementary aid and services. We're talking about like the resource support when a student is being pulled out and for a certain amount of time in a day to work with a special education teacher, maybe with other kids, children, students, or with the teacher alone. or when they're placed in a self-contained classroom. We also talk about the separate day school. That's like a therapeutic placement, or if they have to be in residential or home hospital placement. Those are some of the special classes, separate school, that placement that certain students with disability may be warranted to be placed in. This only occurs if the nature or the severity of disability, again, adversely affect this student in the learning in the regular classroom. If supplementary aids and services are used and they see that it's not reached, the child is still not learning or still not able to access that general education curriculum, then we need to come back to our IEP and say, to the individual educational plan or program, and say, okay, he's in the general education classroom or she's in the general education classroom, and we are using this accommodation, we are using these modifications, we're giving these aids, we're even giving some assistive technology, and maybe a paraprofessional is in that classroom. This is still not working. We got to say why they're not working. Then we need to consider maybe a smaller setting. Maybe we could do a pull-out. Having a resource teacher pull that student out and sit down with that student and meet that student one-on-one. It's only based on how the disability adversely affects the child's learning and how he or she access the curriculum. It's not based on administrative needs or even I just feel that this child would do better if he or she was placed in a smaller setting. There has to be some data to drive the point that his or her disability is adversely affecting him learning or her learning in a general education classroom with the aids and the accommodation that has been presented. In the IEP, and when we trying to get the children to get the student to get the services within the least restricted environment, we need to identify what the strengths are of the students, not just the weakness. A lot of times we do see a lot of weakness that's happening in the child, and this is the reason why he or she cannot access the general curriculum or the program. We need to see the strength of the child as well, because sometimes the strength of the child can help that child access the general curriculum with the appropriate or proper support and accommodation that they need. What are the programs that is helpful for the child? Is there a form of assistive technology? And assistive technology is a piece of instrument that would help the child access the curriculum. And assistive technology would be, evaluation have to be given to the student to see what technology would help this student remain in the general education classroom. The rest of the IEP we talked about will give you services like accommodation modification, the goals and the objection to help address the need of this student. It would talk about the present level of academic achievement performance, what goals are we going to set to help this child meet the general curriculum, stay in the general education classroom. So this is part of what least restricted environment is all about. All the accommodation, all the services that is needed to help the child first stay in the general education classroom. Now, when we're making a placement decision at the IEP meeting, it's not just based on one person. It's not just based on the administrator. It is a group of persons. That means even the parent and those who have knowledge about the child have to make this placement decision. It's drawing in all the evaluation data from the psychologist, from the social work, occupational therapy, from all the related services, nursing services, maybe some outside sources that the parent may provide, that the school may have, to determine what is the appropriate placement for the student. In this placement, once we decide what is the appropriate placement for the student, we must document the harmful effects, and we must document why this placement is appropriate for the student. We also must remember when we're talking to parents and professionals that a lot of times when people hear students or parents or some professional hear special education, we think of a place. Automatically we go to a small setting. Our minds go to the most restricted environment. But special education is a set of services and support, accommodation, modification that will help the child with a disability access the curriculum in the general education classroom or access the general education curriculum. And it's then those services are given to the child in whatever placement that warranted the child. So it's not just based on a place. So when we hear right away that the child might need special education services, our mind shouldn't be, okay, they need to be in autistic program or they need to go to the learning disability classroom. Again, the placement is based on a unique need of the child. It must be looked at as the evaluation, all the support services. We have to pull out all the stops, everything, to see whether or not this child will become successful in the general education classroom. Here's a continuum of the placement, LRE placement, that we talked about. And of course, the least restricted is the regular classroom, and then the regular classroom with support. Then we have the special classes, the special school, the child's home, and hospital institute, which is more restricted. Now, when we talk about the child home, we talk about homebound services, sometimes based on the child's physical or mental disability. The child might need to be educated within their home, so those services will be provided to the child. The special schools are usually what we call therapeutic schools, and those schools are schools based on the disability and how the disability adversely affect the child. And those schools mainly primarily have all children with disability. So the student would not have access to other non-disabled peers. Special classes are usually housed in the public school setting where there are children with non-disabled peers, but the classes are all students with disability, and they are smaller settings. And sometimes our students with disability may need a smaller setting within the public school setting to access the curriculum. If the child is having some reading deficits or math deficits, and they notice that the child learns better when they're in a smaller setting, they're able to access that curriculum while they're in a smaller setting based on that disability and how it adversely affecting that child, then they would a special class, or what we used to call or will call a self-contained placement, warranted for that child. So these are just the continual placement for students with disability. But again, this is based on the child disability and how it adversely affects the child. I want to reiterate that it has to have a lot of data. We need data from the psychological eval, outside eval, if we have them, if the school is willing to take those outside evaluations, because the school do not have to take the outside evaluation, but they need to consider bits and pieces of the evaluation to determine the placement. This here is just, this is where Illinois stands as opposed from the least restricted environment from the most restricted. And Code 1 is our least restricted environment. Code 4 is our most restricted environment. And this is where Illinois stands as opposed to the United States as a whole. The next slide will give you a better understanding of what you're looking at now. Again, just more data to rank Illinois. Code 1, Code 2, and Code 3 is what the Illinois uses to explain the environment, the placement environment that the child is receiving education in. Student support structures. Again, this would let you know, this is some of the things that can take place either in the least restricted environment or in the most restricted environment. And you see at the top in red is the separate faculty. That's the residential part, or maybe the therapeutic setting. Instructional class, self-contained. Periodic pull-out, that's the resources. So it's coming from the most restricted, I'm going down to the least restricted. Co-teaching, that's part-time, full-time. That's when the child is in a general education classroom, and there is a special education teacher in there for students who have IEPs, and they're helping the student through the access to curriculum while the teacher is in the class. Also, the periodic classroom support, such as the paraprofessionals, consultant services. That's when a teacher, special education teacher, consult with maybe the support person, or maybe consult with the general education classroom teacher to let them know about the IEP, to help them understand the IEP and how this disability adversely affects the child. Consultant services is what we call it. You may have those with related services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, even nursing service might also consult with the general education teacher. Adaptation, which is a form of technology. What is the child using in the classroom to access the curriculum? What type of technology he or she may be using to make sure that they have access to the curriculum. And intervention and differential instruction, looking at how the child learning. Teaching to meet the needs of all children in the classroom, but looking at how the child learns. Teach according to how he or she is learning. You might provide one-on-one instruction. You might, for the environment support, you might assign special seating. You might also provide space for movement or break. You know, they even may help the student organize the desk, organize their binder. Sometimes some students could be in a general education classroom and they might need something around the desk to keep them focused. Whatever it takes to make sure that they use all accommodation and modification and support services for their student to access the general education classroom. And again, we talked about the classroom support, the co-teaching. This is going through, again, the continuum of placement and the services and support that can be added in those placements. Now, to keep in mind that these placements all have accommodation, modification, consultative services. Some of them may have paraprofessionals and resources for the students to access the curriculum. While placing a student into a more restricted placement, we have to have, the staff have to say, look, we tried all options, all accommodation, all modification, all support. They have to have that in writing to show this is the reason why we placing the student in, again, in the most restricted environment. And we talked about making sure we put in the possible harmful effect. And some of the things is not being able to access all of the curriculum. You know, sometimes when you have a student that's getting resources and the resource teacher's pulling the student out, they may be missing some instruction in the class time because they're being pulled out. That's why I noticed in Illinois we begin to push in more cold talk classes where the resource teacher is going into the classroom and begin to making sure that the students with disabilities accessing that curriculum, so they won't miss part of the curriculum. And then now you got students making up more work, which may add more frustration. Okay, when you are a parent or a professional with a parent, you're not in agreement with the placement. And you have, the parents may have their reason why they're not in agreement with the placement. First of all, we'd like to encourage you to stay at the IEP meeting. Don't get up, don't run. We know sometimes we get very angry at these places and in this meeting, and sometimes it become overwhelming for us. So then we encourage parents to stay at the meeting. Write down while you questions and concerns you may have about the placement. Write an addendum saying, I'm not in agreement with the placement, or asking for maybe the reconvene of the meeting because you might want to look at the placement. You might want to do more research about the placement, and put it in writing, add it to the IEP, and make sure it's added there. Now, I see here where it got freeze placement. Freeze placement also goes under the mediation due process. Of course, we like to resolve the issues before we get to this level of mediation. This is more of a legal process, but everyone have a right to it. Mediation, due process. So in the process of saying I'm not in agreement with the placement, the parent might not be in agreement with the placement, and so now we're going to go into due process. Sometimes, based on case-by-case situation, the placement will be froze. Wherever the child is at the student is at that time, whatever placement the child is in, before they make another placement decision or placement decision, the child would be right there until the court case is over, until due process is finished, or until the mediator decide what the decision is. Again, we talk about having a reconvene another IEP meeting, get new data, go into the placement, observe the placement, talk to teachers, gather as much information as you can from the team, and the team, if there's administrators, should be there to give much information and resources to the parent about the placement. Some things is helpful is to call another IEP meeting, get someone else in the meeting with you, run it by another parent or a person that knows about the child, and got a educational guess about, understanding about the child. Just making sure that you got all the resources that you need to help make that decision if you're not in agreement with the placement. And again, you have a right to mediation and due process, and we do have training on those topics. Okay, because the students with intellectual and other developmental disability can be educated in the general education classroom. They have found out that they perform better. Their behavior is better. According to Cole's research, that a lot of times students with disability actually fare better in a general education classroom, or with their non-disabled peers. So it's not always just based on the child having an intellectual disability or student having an intellectual disability. We just feel that they need to be placed here because in the past we see this. We place all our students with intellectual disability in a self-contained classroom or a more restricted environment. That's not always the case. We have to look closely to the child's needs, his or her significant needs, and how that disability adversely affects that child. What services, accommodation, paraprofessional services that we can use to make sure that child is successful in that general education classroom. So a lot of times, the harmful effect, sometimes when we put a student in a more restricted environment, could be the behavior changes. The behavior can come, instead of the behavior getting better, the behavior may become worse, even though the student may have a behavior intervention plan. And all of that can take place in a general education classroom in the least restricted environment. But again, I'm going to reiterate that it is based on the child's disability. And if we have placed this child in the general education classroom with the support, and we got data to support that, with all the support, the child is still lagging behind his peers, and maybe there's some behavior issues that arise because they overstimulated in the classroom. All of that needs to be documented so we can make a better placement decision. Okay, and that have completed our least restricted environment webinar. Now, if there's any questions, any concern, please right now, this is the time to ask your questions and your concerns, and voice your concerns. Thank you.
Okay, Lynn, I actually have a question about consultation services. Could you explain what that is and what does that look like? Because sometimes at IEP meetings we hear, you might hear the, say, well, what the OT say, well, I can consult with the special education teacher. Could you kind of explain what that means?
Okay, consultation services is when the occupational therapy talk to the general education classroom to see how is the student adapting in the classroom, how well they're adapting with the support that's given to them, how well are they adapting with their general education peers. They may ask whether or not the child may need more one-on-one at certain times, and that's the information they would get from the general education classroom teacher. And then also the special education teacher as well can do consultant services with the general education teacher by asking them the same thing. I see that Lynn is having issue with math. With the co-taught teacher being in the classroom, how is she adapting during math time? If she's keeping up with her peers, do you think she might need to be pulled out? Or she can, the special education teacher can render to the general education teacher things that can be done to help Lynn or help the student adapt into the general education classroom. So they can also give support to that to the general education teacher as well, to see is there anything else I can do to support this child in the least restricted environment.
Thank you, Lynn. And I also have another question. Often at the center we get calls from parents saying that a teacher or a principal may have told them not to bring their child back to school because this is not the right school for them and that they might be better at another school. Is this a placement issue, and is that the proper procedure?
It is a placement issue, but this is not the proper procedure. If the child have an IEP program or plan, then it's up to the school district to say, look, we see the data, this placement, say if the child is in a co-taught classroom, and this is not the appropriate placement for the child, we need to reconvene an IEP meeting along with the parent or parents and talk about another type of placement. And before we make the decision by telling the parents they should not bring the child back, that is not appropriate at all. And IDEA does not express that at all. IDEA say it's a team decision, and a team should decide whether or not the placement that the child is in is appropriate.
So when the school tells the parent not to bring the child back to school, what does the parent do? Do they continue not to bring the child to school, or?
Well, under the procedure safeguard, and I know that's another training, that's something that's called a prior written notice. The parent should ask in writing for a prior written notice from the school stating the reason why they are saying that this placement is not appropriate and what measure that was taken to prove this. And also the parents should put in writing to them just to summarize what was said to them concerning this placement. And it should not just be this local school. At this point, you need to get maybe a superintendent of special education or someone who can make the special education decision in the meeting. Not so much the case manager unless he or she wear two hats. You need someone from district to come down and help this parent and the team, as a team, make this decision that this placement is not appropriate for this student. Because it's not, and then you're violating the free appropriate public education for the student. So now you're violating faith. The school district is violating faith by saying, take your child out, take them home. We can't help them. Because every child every student have a right to a free appropriate public education. It may look different for each student, but they have a right to that.
You know, I appreciate that you said make sure you get it in writing. So if they don't tell the parent in writing um, not to bring their child to school, should the parent just show up with their child and send them to school the next day, even though they had a verbal conversation with the school?
And even with that, yes, I will as a parent, but even with that, this is where you need to begin to utilize um, the conflict resolution method. Because
Okay.
at this point, if you bringing the child back to school and they keep calling you saying, get the child, there's, first of all, procedure safeguard has been violated. And I don't want to get into that because this is more legal talk
Other
and we're not
training, right?
lawyers. But the parent needs to utilize maybe getting in touch with the Illinois State Board of Ed and letting them know in writing what's going on, and so they can investigate, file a complaint so they can investigate what's going on within the school setting. Because this is a violation of any student rights. Unless they have something in writing stating that we are suspended a child, unless it's a suspension, where they may be suspended a child for a couple of days and they have in writing the reason why. Students with disability can be suspended, but they can be suspended up to 10 days. But they have to have everything in writing. They just can't say take your child home. And so the child can't stay there. And then in this case, in this situation, this is some violation of procedure safeguard, and the State Board of Ed, wherever that State Board of Ed reside at, need to be involved.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Lynn. And I guess I have one last question in regards to, let's say, a flip side where a parent feels their child needs more a more restrictive environment, like homebound services. Could you kind of like briefly explain what we're talking about with those, and like what should the parent expect, if they're getting pushback from the school? So what should the parent be doing if they say, like, I need homebound services, I need, a tutor? Could you give us an idea of what those services look like in the home?
Well, homebound services is where the school district send an instructor or a teacher out to the student home to give them services, or give them work or work on whatever they need to work on to keep them, to make sure they access the curriculum at school. But a lot of times with homebound services, just as the school district needs to have something in writing, the parent needs something in writing to show the reason why the student needs homebound service. There have to be some data. What is happening? If a lot of times we get homebound services for students who have what I call medical disabilities. If they have extreme asthma, and then around the wintertime, I mean extreme asthma where it's a life and death situation, and then around wintertime or the pollen time, the student just can't come out the house. All of that needs to be documented. We also have some medical issues where the student cannot be exposed to anybody because of whatever the medical issues are. That have to be documented. The team have to come together and say, okay, this is where we're going to service the child within the home. And so the services would be provided in the home or in hospital. So sometimes the students are in the hospital because based on their medical condition, there should be some services even in the hospital. Whether it's mental health issues, physical, medical issues, there has to be an agreement with the team, and there have to be some data. Any placement have to show explanation why this is done. So the parent just can't say, I want homebound services because I'm tired of my child walking to school, or I just don't think he needs to be at school. I think he needs to be home with me. That it have to be some concrete data to say that this child homebound services is appropriate for this student. It have to be some real rigid data to show that, and the team have to be in agreement with it as well. And that's what homebound services look like. And even if it's mental illness, because sometimes we have school refusal because of the emotional disability that the child may have and warned, and this is how the disability is adversely affecting the student. So we have to, but again, data is important from both sides, from the parent, professional, service provider. All of those person must have data about the child to prove the explanation why this particular setting is appropriate for the student.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And the reason why I asked that question is because sometimes at the center we do get a call from a parent who may not have, I guess, applied for homebound services, but their child has significant medical needs, and there have been cases where the school continuously marked the child absent or late or held them accountable for missed work.
Right.
Even despite the fact that they had those medical needs that had been brought to the school's attention. So just one last question on that. So how do you get that process started? So let's say it happens in the middle of the school year. How do you know, okay, we're going to need homebound services. When should I start this process? And so when should you start it, and what are the first steps?
If the parent, because based on the child's needs, feels that the child may need homebound services, they need to go to the school district or to whoever make the decision for special education services or homebound services, because homebound services is not always special education services.
Okay.
Then I have a student that, for whatever reason, that's been a general education student all this time, but for some other reason probably got sick, extreme medical conditions have arrived, and they need homebound services. So you need to go to the office and ask, where's the paperwork, because my son or daughter may need homebound services based on the medical condition or based on how, if it is a student with disability, how the disability are adversely affecting them. So they need to talk to those who are in charge, maybe administrator, the superintendent of special education, the principal, the assistant principal, to get that paperwork started. But I will suggest that in writing, put it in writing, and take supporting documents from the hospital, from the therapist, so you can have something to support what you're saying. Some parents say because it's a safety issue, we need to supporting evidence of why this child needs a homebound service. Ask for a meeting, 3 dates and times that you're available. Give them 10 days within 7 days to answer the parent. So that's how you get started, because you need to find out, first of all, who's the star player, who's the person in charge of homebound services. And then you need to draw in the case manager, the special education person, because now it has become more of a special needs thing, because if it's a medical condition right now it's become a medical disability. And it could be it could be a temporary situation, but now everyone needs to be involved to make that decision. Did that answer the question?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much. And this will be my last question. I know I've asked quite a few, but I wanted to ask in regards to, I know the IEP drives the placement, but could you kind of like talk about minutes? So one of the things is if, like, you know, if a student may have so many minutes of service, how much does that affect the placements from, like, maybe going from a general ed class to a maybe a pull-in, you know, special ed teacher to a special education class? How important are those minutes, and how many minutes are we might be talking before we need to have a conversation about placement?
Well, the minutes is based on the school days. How many hours or how many minutes they in the school for a week, for days, depend on each school district. Some schools may go from 7 to 3, so some schools might go from 9 to 2, 9 to 1. The minutes is driven by the school day. So when the team get together and discuss placement and where the child's going to spend this placement to access the curriculum, they do need to look at that. Now, I'm not too sure about the minute calculation, because we have to look at each school. But if you look at the minutes, and the minutes are adding up to practically all the days that he or she in school, or all the hours she in school, they in a least restricted environment, that's stating to me that over 80% of the time they are in the general education classroom with support. Or if you look at the minutes, and the minutes is showing that they are spending all 80% of the time or more in a self-contained classroom. So you have to calculate the minutes in the school district, or the administrative person will sit down and calculate those minutes for the family so they can get understanding how long or how much time they will be spending in this placement time. A lot of times the midpoint is 40, I think it's 45%, 79% students are pulled out. But again, that's based on the school day of each school or each school district. And so the parent needs to understand that formula, and they need to ask the team while they're sitting there, what does this mean? How often is he going to spend, how much time is he or she, this student going to spend in the general education classroom or with peers? If you get an IEP and they talk about the placement, and they're going to say, well, I'm using my name as example, Lynn would spend time in lunch, gym, and music with her general education peers, and then some extracurriculum after school with her general education peers. They kind of give you a highlight that my placement is more restricted. But you have to, again, look at the school district, look at each school, and look at the minutes and the hours in the day, the school day for each school.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I appreciate you answering that. One of the reasons why I bring that up is because sometimes we do get calls at the center where parents may not be, their child may need more support, more services. However, they're not comfortable with them moving to a more restricted environment. So just kind of gauge, some of why that the reasoning behind changing that placement to a more restrictive environment could include that, the student needs more OT, the student needs more speech. Those minutes add up. So
I want to say also, because the child, I don't want to cut in, but because I want to put this out here, because the child may need a certain amount of related services, doesn't mean that when he's or she accessing the general curriculum that they have to be in the most restricted environment. They can have those related services in the general education classroom with the support, training, like, with the teachers being trained, the students having the accommodation modification, aids, assistive technology, all that in the general education classroom. But he or she might need to be pulled out for 45 minutes each day, 60 minutes a day, and those minutes do add up, and they'll tell you how many minutes they are outside the classroom. But because they're getting related services, doesn't automatically put them in the most restricted learning environment, academic learning environment.
Okay, so that means, no, I'm saying, thank you. That's a good point to make, because that could all, that could be an argument made that, well, you need all, you have all these extra minutes, so this, you may have to go to another school, and what you're saying is that those services can be brought into the classroom that doesn't require them to change to a more restrictive environment.
Right. The services, those are the support services, and related services fall under like support services. So if they're in the general education classroom and they're getting support for the reading, for the math, they're getting accommodation modification, they got assistive technology, all while they're in the general education classroom, they even might have, the environment might be a little different. The seating might be different. They might have different type of seating for them so they can stay in the general education classroom. But there might be times where the occupational therapy, the related services, they can also come into the classroom, either consult with the teacher or sit next to the student to make sure those services are provided. Or it might be a time with those small amount of minutes for the related services, such as occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, or any other form of related service, counseling services, come in, and they might have to pull the child out of that environment to give them those related services. for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. But the academic environment that they're going to learn in and where they're going to receive services doesn't have to be a self-contained classroom. It could still be the general education classroom.
Okay.
So it's kind of tricky. The support is it's kind of tricky in the sense if you have to wrap your mind, get understanding of it, that even though the child receive related services, doesn't always say that they need a more restricted environment for learning. And yes, when the related service comes and pull them out for 30 minutes, there are one of the harmful effect with that is the potential harmful effect is that student may be losing instruction. So if the occupational therapist is coming in and pulling that child out for that particular services during math time, then that child is losing some instruction. But that doesn't mean because that is happening, then we no longer can service that child in general education classroom. We need to put him or her in a more restricted environment. That doesn't mean that.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Lynn. I appreciate you answering my questions. At this time, does anyone else have any other questions before we close this webinar for the day? Okay, so it's not looking like we have any other questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And this closes today's webinar. Have a wonderful week.
All right, thank you.